If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Today, I want to cover what is the second in a series of episodes that are going to give you the information that you need to implement your own attention compass. I'm doing this because my goal is to serve you and to help you work through this challenge that I faced just, several years ago, 10 years ago. I faced a challenge of having so much to do that it was stressful and I felt like it wasn't well managed. And so I developed the things, the systems, the workflows, the tools that allowed me to feel like my stuff was well managed, to have less stress about things falling through the cracks, to have more productive approaches to my work and to my information management. So I want to get that into your hands. Yes, I'm a coach. Yes, I'll work with you and make some money doing that. But at the end of the day, the most important thing for me is that you all learn how to do this so that I can serve you in that way. So I want to give you the information that you need in order to be able to do it yourself, so that if finances are some sort of a hurdle, then you can still get the benefit of what we do. As we're looking at this, so the first episode was primarily about the tool that we use to store all the information that we need to store about our world and about our tasks and about our work. And we mentioned the workflows. I mentioned the workflows in that conversation just briefly, but I do want to get into more detail about what those workflows are and why they need to be implemented the way we've implemented them, and what they do for you, so that as you're looking at the tool, you understand where these workflows are, how to build habits around workday behaviors. And this is desk level, day-to-day stuff that we want to be doing such that our work is well managed. When we think about the tool, one of the words that pops into my head when I think about the tool is I think about a backlog. So I'm going to explain what a backlog is. I'm going to tell you some about the submarine analogy, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about constant capture. And these three things are going to set up the underlying principles of all these workflows. These are things that are true about you managing your work and your attention that the workflows then support. So we'll talk about these things briefly, and then we'll get into the first two of the workflows, and I'll explain those workflows to you in detail so that you can begin to implement them. When we look at managing a list of things, I'm a highly trained project management guy, right? Project Management Institute. I studied big project management methodologies. I've studied Agile and Scrum project management methodologies. I've studied a lot of ways to make projects happen. And one of the challenges for projects is keeping track of what needs to be done. And the Agile processes have moved into a backlog management style for the list of things that needs to get done. And it's pretty detailed, and it gets into project management theory and all these different things, and we won't go there. But within the attention compass, we manage the things that need our attention, or the things that are trying to get our attention. We manage those things as a backlog. So what is a backlog? The difference between a backlog and a list is organization. A list can be any pile of ideas written out in some order. A backlog is distinguished by how it's maintained and treated. In very similar ways, you can distinguish a garden from an empty lot because of how the ground and plants in the garden are treated. So that's what makes the difference with a backlog. And there are certain ways of approaching the list such that it turns into a backlog, which is a useful ordered list of things, versus a pile of ideas that is thrown about pretty much at random, in which you can't find anything and there's really no value provided to you. So it's the processes that turn a list or a pile into a backlog. And we'll talk about what those are as we go through. But what I wanted to say here is that these workflows are intended to maintain that big list of stuff that you're going to generate. The workflows are intended to maintain the backlog status of that, to make it a useful list, although a large list, rather than a list that's just a pile of things and causes you more stress and more struggle than it solves in your life. And as we're looking at this backlog, the metaphor of farming comes to mind. So it's about this: how do we treat the dirt and how do we treat the plants such that we get value out of it versus weeds? So as we're thinking about these processes, let's have a backlog thought in our mind. It's also another thing that you can go study and understand what backlog management looks like if you've got more questions about how to do it. The second thing we want to think about is how our attention works and how we want to manage our attention. For a decade now with my clients, I've been using a thing I call the submarine analogy. Your attention is like a submarine. What do I mean? Well, a submarine does its best work when it's deep down under the water and it's hidden and it can get around in secret. But it can't stay there all the time. However, when the submarine is exposed on the surface, it's in more danger. It's less safe than if it's down under the water. And our attention is the same way. If we can keep our focus locally in the nearby sphere of things, then we can protect it better than we can if we're out into communication channels or out into wide open information sources. It's easy to get distracted when you're consuming external information. It's much harder to get distracted if you're consuming information that's already pertinent to you, although it can still happen. The point being that the submarine analogy puts us in mind of the fact that when we're on the surface, metaphorically, when we're on the surface, our attention is available to be hijacked. When we're looking at information channels, our attention is subject to our, I'm going to say, random curiosity of, oh, that's an interesting thing, or oh, that's an amusing thing. And then next thing you know, we're off for a while, frittering away our attention. This means that when we're out in the world communicating with people that are important to us or gathering information, as in research, that these channels can absorb more information than is warranted for them. And that's just the nature of our attention, is that it tends to run off. And so in some ways, we need to work to put in systems and mindsets such that we put some fences around our attention and protect it so that we get our stuff done. And then when we want to get out into the world and let our attention roam and let our curiosity have free reign, that we've got time and space to do that, and we're confident in doing it that way. Another way to look at the submarine analogy is people talk about work-life balance. And if you've listened to this podcast for very long, I don't believe in work-life balance. I think that we are workers. I think that we're constantly doing work. And by work, I mean we're constantly turning ourselves and our environment into what we want it to be. And we're interacting with people and things in order to make that happen. So work-life balance doesn't make a ton of sense to me. However, a kind of quiet, chatty balance, chatty like a chatterbox, kind of quiet versus chatty balance does make sense to me. I think that when we manage our attention well, we have periods where we're focused and things are very quiet and we're dealing with the information or the tasks that we need to deal with. And then I think in other times when we need to interact with the world, we become chatty, if you will. We become open to the give and take of information versus when we're focused, we want to be tightly controlling the information that's in our heads. Anytime you're dealing with your attention, think about the submarine analogy and think about the fact that when you're out there in the world looking at your email or looking at Slack or out doing some research on the internet, or for whatever reason you're on social media, that it's real easy, your attention is exposed and vulnerable. And it's real easy for it to wander off with you. And so we want to be more careful and more disciplined about our attention when it's vulnerable like that. And we want to schedule times when we can just engage in unbridled curiosity and research, but be on guard when you expose yourself to these external facing systems, these communication systems. The third underlying idea I want to talk about is the notion of constant capture. We face enemies in our attempts to focus, and one of them is distraction, and I've defined this elsewhere. And distraction is actually the hardest of the three to deal with because it's not directly manageable. Interruption, the external world impinging on us, is directly manageable. We can close the door, we can go to a coffee shop, we can put on headphones, whatever it is we need to do. We can directly manage interruption, and we're pretty effective at it. But when we get to distraction, by the time you're distracted, it's too late to do something about it. And so we can't directly fight against distraction. We have to fight against it indirectly. And the way that we fight against it is we rob it of information. We rob our distractible brain of ammunition with which to get our attention and distract us. And the way we do that is we don't store things in our skull. We store things out in our tool, out in the world, where it has some sort of a physical reality rather than just represented in our brains. And so the notion there is this idea of constant capture. So when I say capture, I mean implementing the information, the thought, the knowledge into some physical thing in the world, be that paper, be it typed into some bits on your computer, be it talked into a recording. It doesn't matter as long as it's implemented out in the world outside of our skulls. And as we're constantly capturing here, we want to think about having those systems at the ready at any time. So it's not true that we only need to capture when we're on a communication channel, but also true that we need to have the capability to capture when we're doing our work, because that's where distraction happens. So we've talked about three different, perhaps seemingly unrelated things. We've talked about the backlog and the fact that we want our tasks and information to be in a backlog, and that the workflows are about maintaining a backlog. We've talked about the submarine analogy, about how our attention is vulnerable when we're out looking for information or when we're communicating with other people. And we want to be very careful about exposing ourselves that we don't get our attention hijacked. And third is this notion of constant capture, which we do in order to fend off our natural distractibility and to be able to maintain our focus once we get it there. So those are the ideas, the big picture ideas behind the workflows that we're going to talk about now. So in this episode, we'll actually talk about two of the four workflows. And I introduced these workflows in the previous episode. So we'll cover two of them in detail because that's what we've got time to do today. As we're talking about workflows, I want us to go from the most common workflow to the least common, the most frequently implemented workflow to the least frequently implemented workflow. And that's how we'll order our discussion of these 4 different workflows. So the most common act, and I just alluded to it a minute ago, the most common workflow that we engage in Attention Compass is capture, because we're constantly trying to get things out of our heads, out into the world. Capture then is this consistent thing that we do, and I want to describe it for you a little bit so that you'll understand how this workflow enacts itself in our daily processes. Now, when I said capture, that is making information into some physical representation as compared to merely a mental representation. So you capture it by getting it out into the world. There's lots of ways to do that, and all of them are fine. But I want to make the point that you almost definitely already do capture. Defined the way we've defined it, you take mental representations and give them a physical reality in the world, or a quasi-physical reality in your computer. So that's pretty common. So I'm not asking you to do something that's weird or unusual or that you've never done before. What I am going to help you do is organize your capture mechanism to formalize it and make sure that we're doing it well rather than just doing it randomly. And a big part of doing it well is once the physical reality is created, dealing with it then. How do we deal with it? Which also has something to do with where that physical reality is created. Just to make sure we're all clear, we capture when we become aware of new or changed information. Basically, anytime something occurs to us and it might be interesting to us. Oh, hey, that's a odd noise I just heard coming from my car. Write it down, externalize it, capture it. Oh, hey, I just remembered that when I was talking with my daughter at dinner last night, I promised to ... Capture it, okay, and get it out into the physical reality. We want capture to be really quick and easy, primarily so we can capture and get back to work. And when I say quick and easy, I think we'll talk about this at some further length, but I mean instantaneous would be wonderful, but we can't do it that way. So when we're capturing, it needs to be as quick as possible, quick and dirty, and or quick and easy. And then we're able to get back to work and minimize the cost of that distraction on our actual work that we're doing. When we capture, and again, this I want to blend in our backlog terminology. So when we capture, we're actually throwing an information item at the backlog. Now, I use that throwing at the backlog pretty precisely because we're just generally lobbing it in the direction of the backlog. Okay, we're not going to take the time to do the processes that support that item becoming a member of the backlog, but we're throwing it in the direction of the backlog. So that means that the backlog needs to have a physical reality or an IT level reality, because as we capture, we're turning it into a physical thing and throwing it in the direction of the backlog. In this sense, capture is, I'm going to use the term semi-continuous. We're more or less always ready to capture if we need to capture. We don't want to, in the early stages, we don't want to try and squelch the ideas. We just want to get them out and let them express themselves out into our system. And that way we can minimize the loss of focus and get back to what we're doing. So one of the important ideas here is that capture can happen during other work. And I think I've probably made this pretty clear by talking about focus times. But if we're in a piece of work, say we're writing or drafting a document, and an idea occurs to us, then we certainly want to get that out of our heads onto a piece of paper. It'd probably be useful for you to have a stack of paper and a pen or a pencil nearby where you work. So you just grab a sheet, scribble something down, and then get back to what you were doing. So capture can happen during work. Capture often happens during exposure to communication channels. We go to communication channels almost with the intent to capture. So we go to see if there's anything needing capture right there. And that's intentional because we don't want to just become aware of information in these communication channels. We want to capture it so that we can do something with it rather than just try to get it lodged in our skull somewhere, which is bad. Now, I said capture during other work is a good thing, and it is. And do it whenever you need to do it. Don't feel bad for doing that. Don't feel like something's broken if you find yourself needing to capture during other work. But ideally, over time, the need to capture during other work decreases because that's what we're talking about when we say distraction is we're focused and we're intent on some information set and some other information or some other process impinges on our awareness. That's what distraction is. It's always internal. And the only way to combat this, and we talked about this earlier, is to make sure that there's no ammunition. Or I say the only way to combat it, the only way I've found to combat it is to make sure that that part of your brain has no ammunition to throw at you. And then it'll get quiet. So avoiding distraction is why we eject stuff from our skulls, why we capture, and why we want to capture at the time we become aware of this information so that it doesn't continue to drag us down and drag our focus away from where we intend our focus to be. And so in that sense, a good capture process, a well-formalized capture process keeps stuff from lodging in our brains. And the monkey brain, the part of your brain that's back there constantly chattering at you, without information, without ammunition, really will stop having anything to chatter about. And then it slows down. Okay. So we keep stuff from lodging in our brains because we don't want the monkey brain to have ammunition. And again, this just means that since we want to capture in real time, that our capture process needs to be as fast as it can possibly be. So that, as I said before, we get back to our work and don't wallow, if you will, in the distraction. So good capture does two related things. One is it gives us confidence that we're effectively aware of our stuff. That confidence expresses itself as we're not worried about things falling through the cracks. We're not worried that people are trying to reach us and can't get to us. We've created agreements and processes such that people feel like we're appropriately attentive to them. So it's this confidence that we're aware of the stuff that's going on out in the world. I'd say the second of these two related things is we learn confidence that allows our brain to release these ideas out into the system and not hang on to them. And that's a challenge. There's nothing about the act of writing information down that erases it from your neurons. And so, in some sense, a copy of it's still there. And so, what we have to do is train our brain that it's okay to let it go, that we don't need our brain to keep up with it for us. My dogs bark a lot at windows. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to teach them that they do not need to guard my house. But it's a learning that's going to take place over time. So in much the same way, we can train our brains that they don't need to hang on to this stuff, that it's okay, that it's out there, and that we'll deal with it appropriately when it needs dealt with. So what we see, these two related things, as knowledge workers, and if you're listening to this podcast, you're a knowledge worker, at least in part. As knowledge workers, our brain is our productive asset. And in this case, I want to use a workbench metaphor, right? Our attention is this light this light that's on a workbench, and we put ideas on the workbench, and then we manipulate the ideas. Put information on the workbench, and then we manipulate the information on the workbench. And so one of the reasons that all of this capture is important is because if our brain is cluttered, then our workbench is cluttered. And we want to be good craftspeople in our knowledge work. And so we want to use the right tools and the right information when we can. So that brain as workbench metaphor will help us motivate this whole idea of capture and stand on top of our capture processes. Finally, I'll just reiterate that capture really is a fundamental act of the attention compass process, because our idea is that we want stuff out of our skulls so that we can decide what goes in our skulls, and we can decide what to focus on when we want to focus on it, and we can make that decision stick, for lack of a better term. And we've talked about the times when we capture ad hoc, when something occurs to us and we capture, and we also have times when we intentionally capture. So it's this core workflow. And we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit as we go forward into the next workflow. But capture, we want to formalize and understand how and why we capture. So start practicing how to do capture in your own world. Start practicing having a stack of paper and a pencil nearby when you're engaged in other work, so you can jot things down. Practice keeping those physical artifacts in a system, ideally one that's electronic for other reasons that we've talked about, and begin to work on your capture and formalize it. And if you have questions or things don't make sense, you can always come back to this podcast and we can talk through it a little bit more. And perhaps you can grow in your understanding of what we need to be doing as we capture. The second workflow I want to cover in today's episode is what we call processing. So we've captured information and we've flung it in the general direction of the backlog, and it has landed somewhere. Processing is the process of starting to manage the backlog with new information coming into it. Processing is we've captured a bunch of stuff loosely, but we want to make sure that as it goes into the backlog, that it starts its life in an organized way. We don't want to process while we capture, for fear that that will extend our distraction or interruption of focus. So we capture on the fly. Sometimes we capture in intentional periods of time, but we throw all that in the direction of the backlog, and then we do processing to take it from the intake of the backlog and become an actual citizen of the backlog, for this information to become an actual member of the backlog rather than perhaps a candidate member of the backlog. Just trying to throw metaphors around here. We've said that the backlog has an intake, so there's like an inbox to your backlog. And things go in the inbox when you believe they need to head into the backlog, but you didn't have time to organize them well. So it's like the inbox in your email client used properly. So the backlog has an intake. And then processing is going to deal with the stuff from the intake. And stuff in the intake is, by definition, stuff that we've captured. And processing done well can help capture work better, can help the workflow of capture be easier and faster, because then capture can just become this instantaneous thing where we jot down a thought, and then as we process and as we get good at processing, then we refine what that means before it becomes a full member of our backlog. Processing happens on a routine, rhythmic basis. Capture is sometimes on a routine, rhythmic basis, but capture is also an ad hoc process. Processing is not usually an ad hoc process. Okay, but it happens on a routine rhythmic basis in our workday. You might go through a processing loop 6 or 7 times during a workday. Say 7 plus or minus 2 times during your workday. And each episode of a processing loop should take, 10 minutes. And what you're doing with a processing loop is you're managing things as they get into the backlog. I think we mentioned this before. So with attention compass, there's kind of this ideal workflow rhythm. And it's a continuous loop of things, but let's just imagine that you're focused on some work and you get the work done, and you've been working on it for an hour or whatever your time period is. So you've got the work done and it's the end of the hour. And so it's time for you to, look up, look around, make sure that you're available for communication, make sure that you're responsive. At that point, you will take care of things that might prevent future distractions, refill your coffee cup, these kinds of things. Take a look at your calendar and make sure you know what the next hour has in store for you. And then spend some time looking around at the world with your periscope up, as in the submarine analogy. Looking around, you're capturing things, right? You're throwing things in the direction of your backlog. And then once you've satisfied yourself that you're being responsive, then you go into a processing loop. And those things that are candidates for inclusion in the backlog actually get dealt with and processed. Now, this assumes that we're doing a good job with work blocks. Work blocks are very simply a specific length of time that's dedicated to a period of focus, where we attempt to put our attention where we want it to be and keep it there for some period of time, presumably longer than 5 minutes. So that's what a work block is. And so kind of back to this notion of a workflow rhythm. We have a work block where we accomplish our work. At the end of the work block, we open our attention to be responsive to our environment and to other people in our world. At this point, we capture. So we've captured new stuff. We've captured anything that might have occurred to us during our work block. And so we have this pile of captured things in the intake to our backlog. And so we want to do a processing loop and make sure that that gets into the backlog well. So that's this work rhythm. So what then is processing? So we've talked a little bit about when you might process and a little bit about the theory of processing, but how does processing actually work? Well, there are a few different ideas and kind of rules, if you will, about processing. The first rule is always process to empty. Meaning, if you go look at the intake to your backlog and there's 8 things in there, you want to process all 8 things before you stop processing. That way, we're comfortable that things aren't falling through the cracks. We're comfortable that we've observed everything that we're aware of, and then we can re-engage our focus in our next work block. So we always want to process to empty, if at all possible. There are 2, I'm going to say, mechanical steps of processing. First is turn it into what it is, and the second is put it where it belongs. And what we mean by that is turning it into what it is means refining our definition and understanding of what the information item is about. If we need to have a meeting, let's say we need to have a meeting. Okay. If we need to, accomplish the marketing report, then let's say, hey, this is accomplishing the marketing report. So turning it into what it is. That's one of the things that helps the capture process, because if we're good at turning it into what it is during processing, then we can be a little bit more shorthand-ish when we're doing capture in real time. So once we've turned it into what it is, then we can put it where it belongs. And the two steps have to take place in that order, because until we know what it is, we don't know where it belongs. So we want to turn it into what it is, and then two, put it where it belongs. Now, when we become aware of information and we capture information, there are two broad categories of information. There's actionable information and there's reference information. So when we say turn it into what it is, we're usually talking about the actionable information. So here is this piece of information. We want to define, what is my action? What do I need to do in order to respond appropriately to this piece of information? Reference information, on the other hand, really doesn't require a near-term response from us. It doesn't require a near-term action. It's things that we want to be aware of and things that we might use at some future point. Notes for the book manuscript is reference information. Oh, there's a book that I need to add to my reading list. I don't know when I'm going to act on reading the book, but I just want to be aware of this title. So that's the kind of reference information. So actionable information, turn it into what it is. So that's helping us be more precise about what this information is and does in our world, and then allows us the opportunity to know where it belongs and thus put it where it belongs in our system. Step one is turn it into what it is. Step two is to put it where it belongs. When we talk about put it where it belongs, I want you to put it in a place where you are confident you'll see it again at the right time. That's what put it where it belongs means. Okay. At the right time, under the right circumstances, in the right context. Actionable information has at least one additional quality thing that is true about it than does reference information. And that thing is that actionable information requires you to do something. Well, doing something requires attention and time, and usually has the notion of a deadline by which it has to be done, or a right time to do it, those kinds of ideas. So when we're talking about actionable information, put it where it belongs, there's probably a time component involved in that. And we'll talk specifically about a way to keep track of those tasks. That's what we mean when we say task versus reference information. So we'll have a specific way to keep track of those tasks. It's called a tickler file, and you may have heard me talk about it in other areas. It's a great tool for implementing a task-oriented backlog versus the typical task-oriented management system, which is a daily to-do list. But that's something of an aside. Here we are, we're putting it where it belongs because we've turned it into what it is. Putting it where it belongs means that you're confident you'll see it again in the right context. Time is one of those contexts. So we also, our backlog system needs to have this notion of some sort of reminder or time-based, I'm going to say, organization to a significant portion of the material that's there in the backlog. When we're processing, I said earlier, we want to process to empty. Well, empty is kind of a weird notion in a lot of our communication channels. As an example, in most chat apps, you don't delete things. In email, you get a discrete email and it's a thing in and of itself. And when you're done with it, you delete it and you clean it up. Well, chat apps in particular don't work that way. So when we say process to empty, of course, what I mean by that is to process up to the current moment. And then you've dealt with everything up until 3 p.m. I was well aware of what was going on this chat channel up until 3 p.m. Now I'm going to do a work block for 45 minutes. So I'll be unaware of what's going on in this chat channel for 45 minutes, but that's okay because everybody has seen me do this before and they know I'll get back to it. We're processing to empty or to current, if you will. So we've talked about these things that are true about processing, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about general ideas about processing, but I want to do a quick review of the things that we've talked about, the mechanics, if you will. So we talked about process to empty. So that's what you want to think about when you're looking at a discrete communication channel. Your physical mailbox, your voicemail system that has discrete items in it, your email. These things are processed to empty. If you have some notion of an RSS feed, then that probably gets processed to empty. Versus chat apps, verbal communication is sort of episodic, I guess, but particularly chat apps, Slack, messaging apps, those kinds of things. We just want to make sure that we're processing up to the current time. And then another one that works processing to current is news feeds and those external information sites that we go and peruse. It just needs to be up to date. It doesn't need to be processed exhaustively like your email inbox does. Process to empty. I kind of got off on an aside there. I'm sorry, but we're talking about these rules and mechanics of processing. We're recapping that. So let me say it again more briefly. The first rule is we want to process to empty. The second thing is the mechanics of processing. Step one is turn it into what it is. Step two is put it where it belongs. And then the final thing is this process to current. So we know how much to process, we know when we're done processing, and we know that we have some quality measure for the processing that we've done and that we've turned it into what it is and put it where it belongs. So we can know when we're finished processing. So now I want to talk for just a minute about the theory of processing. And what's really going on with processing, when we think about processing, we think about maybe processing the intake to our backlog. And there's a discrete number of new items in there that haven't been processed previously. And we go in there and we process those items, turn it into what it is, put it where it belongs, rinse and repeat until the intake part of our backlog is empty. Well, it's easy to see that we might do a similar thing with our email inbox. And that really is the point, is that we process almost in two layers, almost in two ways. So in one sense, we process the intake of our backlog. In another sense, that same mindset, that processing mindset, can be applied to any information channel. So much like I say our backlog has an intake or an inbox, we can apply that same thinking to our email inbox. We can apply it to a news source. One of the great things about a daily newspaper is you knew when you were done reading it. You could scan the articles and decide what was important. And then when you got to the last page, you were largely done with the newspaper. Well, modern news sites don't allow that luxury. So it's harder to know what's current news and what you've already consumed from yesterday. But we want to process our information channels in the same way that we process the intake to our backlog. We go in and we capture it, turn it into what it is, and put it away. Okay. So we go out and we process these different communication channels, these different information sources. We push that in the direction of the backlog, and then we go and process the backlog. And at that point, we're current, we're up to speed, and we're ready to get back into another work block because we now have dealt with any changes to priority. And when we go into our work block, we look at our backlog, which is an organized, prioritized list of tasks, and then we decide what we're going to do. So just to say that the processing thing really happens in a couple of different versions as we walk through dealing with the information that we're presented with on a daily basis. Another thing I'll say is that as we're processing in the tool, so we've got a bunch of candidate information that needs to go into the backlog, and we're processing that. When we say put it where it belongs, that's really interesting because we don't know where it belongs until we understand what it is. Now, this has implications for how the tool needs to work because the tool is at its core a way to organize a large number of information pieces. When we become aware of new information, one of the words we use for becoming aware of new information is learning, which means we've got new ideas and new things. And so the tool needs to be able to adapt to that. You need to be able to create new storage areas in your tool on the fly because you've become aware that you have an interest in gardening and you start collecting information about gardening. You didn't know that 6 months ago when you laid the tool down. So the tool needs to be adaptable in that sense. And I say that because a lot of our information management tools are not very adaptable at all. And they have to be organized and structured well in advance. And that idea is not going to work for what we're trying to do here. So if you had, and this is for the geeks in the room, if you had some notion that you were going to build a SQL database as your storage tool, well, you can get rid of that idea now because that structure is not adaptable enough for what we'll need to do. And this highlights the point that your schema, your organizational scheme in the tool is going to be emergent. A lot of people go, okay, Larry, I understand all about Attention Compass. Now, how should I create storage locations? How should I categorize these things? And at that point, I look them square in the eye and I say, I have no idea. Because you want to structure the information the way your brain works. And I can't know how your brain works. The point here is don't worry too much about the structure. Don't ever go and say, oh, I need to build out, 243 places for this information to live. Instead, pick a tool that has an adaptable organizational schema. Okay. Many of the note-taking apps work this way. And by note-taking apps, I mean Evernote, Notion, OneNote, all these kinds of things. You can organize on the fly rather than having to structure something in advance. So that's one implication. The other implication is don't ever block out an afternoon to figure out what your folder structure needs to be in the tool. You'll never know that, and it'll always be wrong. And then if you've got a structure that you built that's wrong, your tendency is to just use it wrongly. And that's how things get lost. So the tool has to have this emergent organizational scheme. And I think that you'll find certain tools have that and certain tools don't. If you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me and I'll give you a list of tools or comment on your tool of choice to see if it has this emergent schema property. In addition to having an emergent schema, and we talked about this previously, the tool has to have a reminder schema because that's where actionable information lives. An example of a reminder schema is a tickler file. And I've talked about this in several different places. A tickler file, and you can look it up on the web, it's called a tickler file or a suspension file, is specifically built such that it manages task-based reminders very well. I would suggest that a tickler file manages task-based reminders better than a calendar, and certainly better than any alarm-driven system. But the point is that the tool has to have something like this built in it because you're going to need it to help you deal well with your actionable information. But as great as a tickler file is, this is the part where I have to say it's only ideally suited for actionable information. It's not well suited at all for reference information. And so a tickler file is a good start, but it's an incomplete solution. And of the information that you need to be managing, I would suggest that actionable information is probably 20 or 25% of the items that you need to be dealing with. And the other 75 or 80% is this reference information that you need to have somewhere to organize. And so it makes sense to have one tool that then does both things. So while a tickler file is a good start, your professional grade tool needs to have both a strong reminder system and a strong reference information storage schema as well. And then I'll also add a third thing that it needs to have, which is some sense of prioritization among different items. Priority, of course, is different from time. If you order things in a time sequence, that's a different thing than ordering them in priority. So there are at least 3 schemas that your storage tool needs to be able to present to you. One is a reminder schema. You can see that by implementing a tickler file and understanding how it works, what a good reminder schema looks like. You need a priority schema, which is independent of the time schema. Okay, they may be related, but they're independent and need to be independent. So that's the second one, is a priority schema. Now, the third one is reference information, which is a more general cataloging schema. Think card catalog in a library, think properties of a piece of recorded information, a piece of reference information. Oh, it's about the book I want to write, and it's important for my wife's birthday, and the kids need to know this, and it's about the Smith project. These kinds of things are parameters in that part of the schema that the tool needs to have. As I said, if you're interested in some tool recommendation, feel free to shoot me an email and we'll have a conversation about it. I'd be happy to comment. I don't know all the tools that are out there, but I think I can help you decide if your tool of choice actually fits the bill here. And if it does, then we'll use it. And if it doesn't, but I'm happy to have that conversation with you. So briefly, let's recap. What have we talked about today? Well, in general, we've talked about 2 of the 4 workflows, and I think we've given some good detail on how those 2 workflows are structured, when to implement those workflows in your world, how common they are, and then how to do the work that the workflow represents. On the way by, we talked about 3 underlying ideas about the way to manage information like this. So we talked about what is a backlog and why do we need one. We talked about the submarine analogy relative to our attention. And we talked about this notion of constant capture as our primary defense against distraction. And that's distraction as compared to interruption. So with those 3 kind of mindset ideas, we moved into talking about starting with capture, and capture is the fundamental act of good information and thus task management. We have to capture it to get it out of our skulls so that we can put it in a management system that we're confident in. So capture is the act of turning a thing that's made up of thought and brain neuron impulses, turning that into something in the physical world so that we can deal with it effectively. And then once we start doing that, then we realize this need for processing. Processing is what differentiates a backlog, which is a good thing, from a disorganized pile of stuff, which is a bad thing. So as we're doing processing, that's actually the gardening of the system. It's at least step one in the gardening of the system. It's deciding what plants need to be planted and where the seeds need to go and what the weeds are and what needs to be pulled. And that's what processing is in our gardening metaphor. Again, the intention here is to put this information into your hands so that you can begin to implement an attention compass, because my goal is for you to have calm, confident productivity. That said, if I can help you implement your attention compass, if you feel like you need some support on that, I'm happy to do that. Just reach out and we can talk about what that might look like. It could be that you just need to listen to some specific podcast episodes. It could be that you need some help selecting a tool, or it could be that you need some more involved coaching, and we'll talk about what that looks like for you. So happy to be available to you for that, and would love for you to reach out and give me some input and some feedback, and to think about taking action, to think about beginning to implement your own attention compass, to think about not waiting until somebody does it for you, but start doing it yourself so that you can learn about a system that will support your best self in managing tasks and information. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.